It was the night television history was made, when over 100 million Americans sat in silence, tears streaming down their faces, watching the final moments of MASH. But for Alda, the man who had carried the show for 11 years, this wasn't just another episode. It was the hardest goodbye of his life. As the cameras rolled on Goodbye, Farewell, and Amen, Alda wasn't just acting, he was living every emotion written into Hawkeye Pierce's farewell. Behind that trembling smile was the weight of a decade of laughter, heartbreak, and loss. The lines between character and actor completely disappeared. Crew members wept behind the monitors. Even the director had to call for multiple breaks just so everyone could compose themselves. Few realized what was happening off-screen during those final days. Alda was physically exhausted, emotionally drained, and terrified of saying goodbye to the family that had defined his entire career. Every tear on screen was real, every hug genuine, every word a goodbye to something irreplaceable. By the time the last scene faded to black, television would never be the same again. What viewers saw as the end of a beloved comedy was, for Alda, a deeply personal farewell, one that mirrored the trauma, healing, and heartbreak of war itself. This is the story of Alda's final episode on MASH, and why it remains one of the most devastating farewells ever captured on television. When MASH first aired in 1972, no one could have predicted that it would become one of the most beloved and culturally significant shows in television history. Based on the 1970 film of the same name, it began as a satirical take on the Korean War, but soon transformed into something far deeper. A reflection of humanity, humor, and heartbreak in the face of chaos. At the center of it all stood Alda, portraying Captain Benjamin Franklin Hawkeye Pierce, the wisecracking surgeon whose compassion and wit made him the soul of the 47th. By the early 1980s, MASH had evolved far beyond a typical comedy. Under Alda's influence, it grew more introspective and emotionally raw. The show's humor was still sharp, but the laughter was often followed by a sobering silence, a reminder that beneath every joke was a world wounded by war. Alda wasn't just the star. He became the heartbeat of the series. He directed and wrote several episodes, pushing the boundaries of what a television show could achieve. But as the 11th season approached, the cast and crew knew the end was near. The decision to wrap up the series wasn't taken lightly. After more than a decade of portraying life in a mobile Army surgical hospital, the actors had grown inseparable. Their on-screen chemistry was no act. It came from years of shared experiences, pranks, late-night rehearsals, and tearful goodbyes to castmates who had left before the finale. When production began on the final episode, Goodbye, Farewell, and Amen, the atmosphere on set was unlike anything they'd ever felt. The script was longer, darker, and more emotionally charged than any before it. It would run for 2.5 hours, making it the longest series finale in television history at the time. Alda co-wrote and directed the episode himself, a decision that added even more emotional weight to his performance. But directing his own farewell proved excruciating. Each scene forced Alda to confront the reality that MASH was ending, and that his days as Hawkeye Pierce were numbered. During one emotionally charged sequence, Alda reportedly struggled to get through his lines, his voice cracking as the memories of 11 years flooded back. Crew members would later recall how the normally confident actor had to pause between takes, walking alone along the studio lot just to gather his thoughts. Behind the camera, tissues were passed around as if they were part of the script. Even hardened technicians couldn't hold back tears. It wasn't just the story of a doctor saying goodbye to his comrades. It was a family of real people saying farewell to something that had shaped their lives. By the time filming wrapped, the cast stood together in stunned silence. No applause, no cheering, just quiet, tearful hugs. Alda's wife, Arlene, who had been with him through the show's entire run, later described the final day as bittersweet beyond words. For Alan, it felt like closing a chapter of his own life. When the episode finally aired on February 28, 1983, it became a national event. Streets emptied, restaurants closed early, and an estimated 106 million Americans tuned in to watch. As Hawkeye boarded that final helicopter, the sound of its blades fading into the distance symbolized more than the end of a war. It was the sound of millions saying goodbye. Alan Alda's performance in that final episode wasn't just acting, it was catharsis. He poured every ounce of emotion into that farewell, creating one of the most unforgettable moments in television history. To truly understand why Alan Alda's final episode of MASH hit so hard, you have to look at the years leading up to it. Behind the humor, the clever one-liners, and the camaraderie on set, there was always a deeper current of pain. The cast wasn't just portraying soldiers and doctors, they were carrying the emotional scars of real war stories, of fans who had written to them from Vietnam, saying the show helped them heal. For Alda, MASH was never just about laughs. It was about exposing the absurdity and tragedy of war, using humor as a form of survival. He once said, "We weren't making a show about heroes. We were making a show about people. Flawed, frightened, funny people trying to stay sane in insane circumstances." That philosophy guided every scene he wrote and every line he delivered. As the series neared its end, Alda's personal connection to Hawkeye grew more intense. He had spent more than a decade living inside that character's mind. The compassionate doctor who used wit as armor against the horrors around him. And in that final episode, Alda made sure Hawkeye's story came full circle. The heart of goodbye, farewell, and amen revolves around trauma. Not just the kind that comes from physical wounds, but the invisible kind that lingers long after the fighting stops. Hawkeye suffers a mental breakdown, haunted by a tragic event that slowly unravels through flashbacks. It was a bold, painful storyline, one that mirrored the experiences of countless veterans who struggled in silence. Filming those scenes took a toll on Alda. As both director and actor, he carried the burden of bringing authenticity to every emotion. During one sequence, where Hawkeye recounts a haunting memory to psychiatrist Dr. Sidney Friedman, the tension on set was palpable. Everyone watching knew they were witnessing something real. The way Alda's voice trembled, the way he looked down before speaking, none of it was rehearsed. It was raw emotion, drawn from somewhere deep within. Even off-screen, the line between Alan and Hawkeye began to blur. Cast members recalled how quiet he became between takes, often retreating to think alone. The normally lively set was subdued. Jokes were rare, laughter short-lived. It felt as though the entire crew was mourning in advance, not just for the characters, but for the end of an era in their own lives. For Alda, this wasn't simply the end of a television show. It was a personal farewell to a version of himself. Hawkeye had taught him compassion, resilience, and how to confront pain with grace. Saying goodbye meant losing a part of his identity, the man he had been for more than a decade. When the episode finally came together in the editing room, even the editors struggled to keep their composure. The blend of humor and heartbreak, the quiet moments between chaos, everything about it felt like a tribute to the show's legacy. And when that final helicopter lifted off, leaving the word goodbye spelled out in stones on the ground, it wasn't just Hawkeye leaving the camp. It was Alan Alda walking away from one of the most defining roles in television history. Years later, Alda would admit that watching the finale still makes him emotional. It wasn't just a piece of fiction. It was a shared goodbye between friends, colleagues, and millions of viewers who had grown up with the show. That's why MASH's ending wasn't just powerful. It was healing. It gave everyone, cast, crew, and audience alike, a way to say farewell to something that had become much more than television. When the final scene of MASH wrapped, the studio fell into a silence that words could hardly describe. The laughter that had once filled the set was replaced with quiet reflection. For Alda, the realization hit hard. After 11 years, the family he had built on that soundstage was gone. The mess tents, the operating tables, the muddy roads of the 4077th, all of it would soon be dismantled. What remained were memories, etched deeply into his heart. As Alda left the set for the last time, he carried with him an invisible weight. MASH had been his second home, a sanctuary of creativity and friendship. Now, that chapter had closed. For weeks after filming ended, Alda admitted that he struggled with an overwhelming emptiness. It wasn't just the end of a job. It felt like the loss of something profoundly personal. He had lived through Hawkeye's eyes for so long that stepping away from him felt like losing an old friend. Meanwhile, the world outside the studio was preparing for the television event of the decade. On February 28, 1983, when Goodbye, Farewell, and Amen finally aired, the world stopped to watch. Over 106 million viewers tuned in, a record that would stand for decades. Across America, families gathered in living rooms, holding tissues, knowing this was the last time they'd see the doctors and nurses of the 4077th. The emotional weight of that finale reached beyond entertainment. Viewers saw their own goodbyes reflected in the characters. Soldiers who had served in Korea and Vietnam wrote to Alda, saying the show had helped them confront their own trauma. One letter, which Alda kept for years, came from a veteran who said, "You made us laugh when we thought we'd forgotten how." Those words meant more to him than any award or rating ever could. In the days following the broadcast, news outlets declared MASH's finale as the end of the television era. Critics called it a masterpiece, a blend of tragedy, humor, and humanity that transcended its genre. But for Alda, fame was the least of it. What truly mattered to him was that the show ended with dignity. He wanted it to leave a mark, not just on television history, but on the hearts of those who watched it. Still, the emotional toll lingered. In interviews, Alda confessed that he couldn't bring himself to rewatch the finale for years. Every frame reminded him of friendships, laughter, and moments that would never return. He once said, "It wasn't just acting. We really loved each other." That's what people felt when they watched us say goodbye. After MASH, Alda faced a new kind of challenge, rediscovering himself beyond Hawkeye. He moved into directing films, writing books, and pursuing advocacy for science, communication, and empathy. But no matter what he achieved, the shadow of MASH remained close. Fans still recognized him as the witty, compassionate doctor who used humor to heal the wounds of war. And truthfully, Alda never wanted to escape that legacy. He was proud of it. Even decades later, the finale continues to touch new generations. Reruns still bring in viewers who weren't even born when it first aired. And yet, they cry as if saying goodbye themselves. That's the timeless power of MASH. It wasn't about war, or even comedy. It was about people. Alda once said that the show's success came from its honesty, the courage to show that laughter and sorrow can exist side by side. That's what made the final episode so devastating, because behind every joke was truth, and behind every goodbye was love. And when the helicopter lifted into the sky for the last time, it wasn't just Hawkeye leaving Korea. It was Alda, quietly flying away from a part of his life that had changed television and himself forever. Decades after MASH went off the air, Alda's final episode remains one of the most memorable moments in television history. It wasn't just the ratings, although 106 million viewers watched it live. It was the emotional resonance, the authenticity, and the humanity that Alda brought to the screen. Goodbye, Farewell, and Amen wasn't just a finale. It was a masterclass in storytelling that balanced humor, heartbreak, and hope. For Alda, the episode became a personal milestone. He had spent over a decade shaping Hawkeye Pierce, directing episodes, writing scripts, and mentoring castmates. Saying goodbye to that world was like closing a chapter on his own life. In interviews years later, he admitted that even rehearsing some of the scenes had left him exhausted, emotionally raw, and questioning whether he could truly let go. Each tear on camera, every tremor in his voice, was genuine. Alda didn't just perform. He lived the moment, making the audience feel the gravity of Farewell in a way few actors could. The finale's impact on television cannot be overstated. It set a standard for how a series could end, combining closure, emotional depth, and respect for the characters' journeys. Many shows have tried to replicate that balance, but few have succeeded. Alda's work as both actor and director demonstrated that television could be an art form capable of conveying profound human truths. But beyond professional achievement, the finale had a deeply personal effect on Alda. For years, he reflected on what Hawkeye Pierce had taught him: compassion, resilience, and the ability to find light in the darkest times. Leaving the 4077th behind was bittersweet. He had lost daily contact with a group of people who had become more than colleagues. They were family. The experience shaped his future projects, inspiring him to explore storytelling that emphasized empathy, understanding, and the human experience. Fans, too, continue to feel the weight of Alda's farewell. New generations discover the show and are moved by the emotional honesty he brought to the screen. Letters, interviews, and social media posts show that viewers still relate to Hawkeye's struggles and triumphs. The finale is a reminder that laughter and sorrow are intertwined, and that true storytelling doesn't shy away from either. Even today, Alan Alda's legacy as Hawkeye Pierce stands as a testament to dedication, talent, and heart. His final performance reminds us that television can do more than entertain. It can touch lives, provoke thought, and heal emotional wounds. That helicopter rising into the sky wasn't just a narrative device. It symbolized the end of a chapter that changed countless lives, both on and off screen. In the end, MASH's finale is unforgettable because it shows what it means to say goodbye, not just as a character, but as a person leaving a part of their life behind. For Alan Alda, that goodbye was more than television. It was a deeply human, profoundly emotional farewell, one that continues to resonate with audiences around the world. Alan Alda left the 4077th behind, but his legacy endures, reminding us all of the power of compassion, humor, and humanity, even in the face of goodbye.